Hello and welcome back to Paleocast. My name is Dave Marshall and you're listening to episode 155, which is the second part of our look at the Byron Dig with Dr. Richard Laub. As with all our two-part episodes, we begin with the recommendation that if you've not yet listened to the first part, that's where you should start. There you'll be getting all the context you need to understand how the Byron Dig got started and what the lay of the land was. In this second part, we're finally going to start pulling out some fossils as we describe the evolution of the site through each of its phases of deposition. Finally, we'll wrap things up by looking at the last few days of the dig and its continuing legacy. For me, having read Dick's book and even having conducted this interview, I've felt such a wonderful proximity to the dig, to some of the events and indeed many of the discoveries. And I can tell you that there's just so much more to know than we've managed to cover in just these two episodes. So if you have enjoyed them, then I really do recommend picking up a copy of the book for yourself. Fortunately for Yvonne, your name was randomly chosen in our competition, and so Columbia University Press will be sending you a copy of the book. And I do hope that you enjoy reading it whilst you're exploring the Ediacaran and Cambrian of Canada over the next 30 years. And as always, the images to accompany this episode are available on our website and are very useful for separating out the different layers we talk about and for seeing just how incredibly muddy the site was. Any help you can give us to reach new audiences on social media through likes and shares will always be appreciated, and reviews on iTunes and Facebook really help us raise our profile. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Right then, so let's have a look at some of the fauna and flora that you were digging up. So you've mentioned a few things so far, but obviously the biggest, the most important, what am I talking about? The biggest, the most impressive, there we go, fossils that we've talked about so far are those of the Mastodon. Those were what were originally dug up, what were exciting, those and caribou, perhaps, I think you said. Mm-hmm. But were those the kinds of things that you were really after, the big, showy, impressive mammals?
Well, initially we thought, again, that it was the Byron Mastodon. We thought that this was in effect, the tomb of an individual animal, and very soon afterward we came to realize this was not a single tomb. This was, in effect, a series of cities stacked one on top of another, more like a tell. Yes, you're right. The bones of the Mastodon visually are probably the most impressive things we find there. There's no doubt about that. And they're very important, and we've gotten very valuable information from them. However, I would say that by and large, the most scientifically important things that we found were almost always small things.
Okay. So how did you divide the labor between looking for big, very, very big things and looking for very, very small things? Because if I see a mammoth tusk, like sticking out of the sediment, I am in there with a spade. I am getting that out. That is what I'm going to focus on. How would you say to, especially like some fresh-faced volunteers, wait a second, don't touch that because there might be a tiny, tiny little rat tooth underneath it?
Well, that's exactly what we did. All of our excavation was done with trowels, and we would scrape off the surface centimeter by centimeter to work our way down because of recognizing exactly what you've just said. If we had just gone at it with the idea of, well, let's get these big bones out of here, that's really all we're after, we would have missed really the most important stories that the site had to tell. We would miss objects that are a centimeter or less in diameter that were, one of a kind things, or just had very important information wrapped up in them. So we came to realize that you concern yourself with the sediment and you gradually expose those large bones. It's important to do it that way anyway, because if you try to yank a large bone or tusk or something like that out of the ground, you could damage it.
So what other kinds of animals did you end up finding? I'm guessing this would be different through all the different layers as well. But in terms of like the whole history of the site, what different animals did you find?
Well, to begin with the Pleistocene, we found the remains of 7 different types of animals. We found Mastodon, caribou, stag moose, which is a moose-sized animal now extinct, that was actually about a little bit more lanky. It was about the size of a moose, but a little bit more lanky in its build, a little more lightly built, with very peculiar, at least to our eyes, antlers. We found the long-nosed peccary called Mylohyus. We found a giant beaver. This is a beaver Castoroides, which was almost the size of a black bear. We found a hare, Lepus, a lagomorph, and quite surprisingly, we found the California condor, which now still exists, but it only exists in California. Its remains have been found in the Pleistocene deposits elsewhere in North America, but always along the Gulf Coast, a couple of 1,000 kilometers away from New York State, and a little ways up the West Coast. So those 7 types of animals are what we found in the Pleistocene. But we also found, although we did not find physical remains of it, I think evidence that there was a large carnivore there, and I suspect it was a grizzly bear, and that's based upon gnawing, really major gnawing on very large mastodon bones, one of which is illustrated in the book. So we've got 7 and I think 8 different types of mammals living there, or at least represented at the site. Then when you get up into the...
sorry, let's deal with this layer first. Mm-hmm. A peccary, is that kind of like a pig-like animal? Am I getting that right?
Yes, it doesn't belong, as I understand it, to the same family, but it would look roughly like a pig. And you find them, you find peccaries now in southern North America, and then on down into Latin America.
Okay, and then a bear-sized giant beaver. Okay, this sounds like a new Paleocast episode, because I'm having difficulty imagining that. Well, was that a surprise to get all of these?
To get all of these? I'd say it was a delight. I suppose so, because they appeared gradually throughout the years that we dug there. They didn't all appear in a puff of smoke. Initially, all we had were Mastodon and caribou, because caribou had been found there in the initial test pit that was done by archaeologists. And then a little bit after that, we found a couple of teeth that we identified as belonging to the stag moose. And in the second year we dug there, we found the California condor bone. We found it that year, and then an additional bone each of the following 2 years. That actually brought in one of the people who worked with me for a number of years. This is Dr. David Stedman, who at that time was with the New York State Museum. He is one of the great experts in fossil recognizing bones of birds at archaeological and paleontological sites. He recognized that this was the California condor, and that brought him in. So every few years, something new would be found. The giant beaver was a little bit of a surprise. We knew the giant beaver did occur in New York State, but this tooth was one of the objects that we recognized from the collection made in the 1959 reconnaissance. So species were added to our bestiary over the years.
The thing I like about this as well is that you have such a mix of recognizable organisms and then ones that seem just so ancient. You've got these Californian condors in New York. You've got the grizzly bear, but then they're there with mastodons. You've got a grizzly bear gnawing on a mastodon. That feels so anachronistic to me. These things shouldn't be together. They're separated in my mind, and yet here they are, and there's interaction between them.
Right, because, well, for the reason I think you're implying, that we think of the grizzly bear or the black bear or even the modern, beaver, Castor canadensis, as just in terms of modern times. And yet each of those three did exist in this area during the Ice Age. We know that from the fossils that have been found and recognized. So when the Ice Age ended, many of the larger animals became extinct, but some of them were extirpated. That means they didn't die out, but they moved to other areas, such as the caribou, which moved further north with the end of the Ice Age. And others still stayed in the area, such as the so-called modern beaver and the black bear.
Okay, so whilst we're down in this Pleistocene layer, can we look at the plants, trees, and pollen and whatnot, and then we've got a complete idea of this individual ecosystem. Then we'll move up a layer. So, yes. Which plants were there?
Well, we found very little in the way of plant remains, except for these peculiar short chopped twigs that suffuse much of the Ice Age fossiliferous layer. These turned out to be conifer twigs. They were from spruce and some from pine and possibly juniper. The macrofossils that we found were cones of the jack pine, which today is found in central Canada, and of the white spruce, which also is more boreal. That's what we found in the Pleistocene horizon. In addition, later on in the dig, we found we actually found a couple of sprigs of spruce, twigs of spruce that still had the needles on them. And in fact, when they were first unearthed, these needles were still green, believe it or not. And in addition to that, we found a beautifully preserved little sprig that had a couple of seed pods on it that looked like it's just modern. And I was able to get that identified by an amateur botanist in this area as chelone, Chelone, which is a plant that occurs today, but that was obviously also there during the Pleistocene, and I suspect was being eaten by mastodons. But by and large, so those are the macrofossils. But when you look at the pollen, which is something that was done by one of my colleagues from up in the University of Toronto and the Royal Ontario Museum, Dr. John McAndrews, he studied pollen at the site, and he found it was predominantly, the trees were predominantly spruce and pine, apparently jack pine, based upon the cones that we found. But he also found that most of the pollen were grasses and sedges. In fact, he was surprised to find that at this site, the pollen of the herbaceous pollen, meaning the pollen of low ground dwelling plants like those grasses and sedges, greatly outnumbered the pollen of the trees. And this was the only area in the Northeast North America in which that was the case for the late Pleistocene. Everywhere else, the pollen was dominated by tree pollen, especially spruce and pine. And for quite a while, it was a puzzle as to why that should be. What was different about the Hiscock site?
What was different about the Hiscock site?
Well, we wouldn't fully understand that till much later. Eventually, what we started to feel is that probably the trees were being browsed by mastodons, which were browsers. They ate largely, mostly branches and leaves from trees, the way deer do. Although we know that they also ate plants on the ground. From what we know of areas where there's a lot of elephant activity today, elephants are able to really destroy trees or keep them from growing too big, and they damage them sometimes just by moving around and knocking them over. So we figured that was probably what was going on, and the presence of the pollen and of these wood fragments, these twig fragments of conifer, probably reflected the presence nearby of scattered stands of spruce and pine. As I mentioned toward the last chapter of the book, however, I came across information about a site in Africa that, from what I can see, is a dead ringer for what the Hiscock site must have been like back in the late Pleistocene. And that also reflected the activity of proboscideans, in the modern case elephants, forest elephants, in the ancient case mastodons, in the vicinity of who were living around a water hole and who were browsing on the trees that surrounded the water hole and trampling on the ground to prevent these trees from encroaching too close to the water hole.
Okay, so is that what the site is? It's essentially this depression that you've got. It's essentially a watering hole that's filled up over many years, and the lack of trees is because mastodons are there drinking and eating the trees. It's that direct comparison.
From what I can see, it is. And one of the very peculiar finds we made was actually a large log buried deep in the Ice Age strata. The only one we'd ever found, and that was examined by someone who specialized in the study of wood and growth rings in wood. And she said it looked to her like something which it had a lot of bases of branches. She said it looked like something which a tree whose branches were constantly being broken off and then regrowing, which would be consistent with the idea of a population of mastodons browsing in a nearby forest.
Okay. It's a wonderful kind of complete, sort of complete view of an ecosystem. There's so much that you've got there, so many different interactions, mammoths shaping the plants attracting the mammoths, the water hole attracting the mammoths, and everything being preserved in there. It's a really nice view of a whole ecosystem.
Yeah, it was one of the more satisfying things for me that came out of this study.
Okay, and so then if we're done with this layer, can we move up 1,000 years later to the oldest of the woody layers?
Okay, the older woody layer. I initially thought that there was a hiatus, a break in sedimentation after the deposit of the Pleistocene layer, because in most places there's a very sharp boundary between the peaty deposits and the Ice Age deposits. However, in some areas, I found it very difficult to distinguish where that boundary was. If I followed the strata in the walls of the pit, I found it was not obvious where the Pleistocene fossiliferous deposits ended and the woody layer began. In one case, what I did was I just looked at it literally centimeter by centimeter by centimeter, and this is where William Smith comes in with his index fossils. I found that as I would go up in the grayish in the Pleistocene deposits, I would be finding a lot of those short chopped twigs, which were typical of the Pleistocene deposits. Then I came to a particular very sharp change where they disappeared. And now what I was finding were small polished pieces of white gravel, white milky quartz, small, highly polished pieces that we think were gastroliths of birds. And among them also sort of brownish, papery seed pod covers, which were typical, we found, of the woody layer. And when I followed a line from bottom up to top, I found that this change happened very sharp, razor sharp. And that clearly was the boundary between the Pleistocene fossiliferous deposits and what we were calling the woody layer. And what that suggested to me was that at least in some places in this basin, the transition was there was very little change in the transition. It was not so much a sedimentary change as an environmental change, change in the biota. In the older woody layer, it's very thin and doesn't have quite as many fossils in it. What we did recognize there are remains of elk, and we also found in there a wing bone of a Canada goose, Branta canadensis, although whether it actually dates from that time or was intruded into there, we can't be sure, but it was definitely within that layer. Someday we may have it radiocarbon dated to find out. And we also found in there a tooth of a black bear. And the same thing holds for that. Stratigraphically, it was found in that layer. Whether it actually dates from that time, we cannot be wholly sure. But the primary deposits in there, what we primarily find there are some bird bones. I believe also the passenger pigeon and deer remains as well. Mm. And we find different types of wood, but here what we find now is are cones from the white pine, which is a very tall pine, and also aspen, and we also find larch or tamarack. Cones of tamarack in there as well. So there's definitely been a change. First of all, there's now large trees growing in and around this basin, and the fauna has changed. Now the mastodons are gone. As they're no longer there as the large herbivores. Mastodons and the caribou and the stag moose are gone from the area, and instead they've been replaced by elk or wapiti, and by deer.
Okay, had the mastodon gone extinct, or was that a change in just the environment? Now they're not coming to this waterhole.
Well, I found, to me, a suggestive evidence that mastodon was still around by around 9,000, 9,100 radiocarbon years ago. I judge this on the basis of those short chopped twigs, which we believe are mastodon gastrointestinal contents. If that is what they are indeed, we have several radiocarbon dates on them that are in the 9,000. So if that's the case, and mastodons were still around at that time, they had not yet gone extinct. Whether they disappeared from this area at the same time as they disappeared from the earth is a little bit harder to say. But from all the evidence that I've seen and that I hear, mastodons were gone by around 9,000 BP.
Wow, so it's not just that there are no mastodon bones in the sediment, it's that the sediment itself has been changed by the loss of the mastodons. The environment, the trees are growing back now.
Yes,
everything is changing.
In fact, that's my suspicion. Clearly, the climate was changing because the trees were different from the ones that were there during the Pleistocene and the earliest Holocene. But also, I found myself suspecting that this change from more or less non-organic sediment, the what we call the fibrous gravelly clay, the gray fossil-bearing sediment of the Pleistocene, the change from that into the peat, which was organic rich, largely made of partly decomposed woody material, may reflect not so much a climatic change, but the disappearance of mastodons from the area, so that they were no longer there holding the forest back. I think that's a conclusion that's at least worth thinking about, and perhaps seeing if it's consistent with what we find elsewhere.
So then we have a depositional hiatus when there's no record, and that will take us back another few thousand years to the yellow clay, is it?
Well, the yellow clay actually falls within that hiatus, and it falls in that hiatus because if we are interpreting it correctly, and I was guided in this, by the way, by a Canadian archaeologist, that yellow clay appears to represent a forest fire. It contains it has a greasy feel to it, which would be typical of something that had ash in it. It has a lot of charcoal, and it has a lot of calcined or burned bone, mostly frogs, some rodents, but also some deer as well. And it radiocarbon dates to roughly 3,000 years ago. So that falls within that 6,000 year hiatus. Our understanding is that what happened was that the trees that were holding anchoring down the soil and the hills surrounding the basin died, fell over, they were burned, and so much of the protection for the sediment of those surrounding hills was gone, and a lot of it washed down into the basin. So that represented another depositional event during the otherwise a broad, almost 6,000 year hiatus.
Okay, and this is like within the time that the pyramids have been built by now. I think. Mm-hmm. It's crazy, the overlap. Okay, so then we go into the younger woody layer. We've got another part of this hiatus, and we are, 2,000 years ago or something?
Start picking up around 2,000, mostly 1,000 years ago, but we do get some dates closer to 2,000. The woody layer here is extremely rich. It's the richest layer in terms of fossils. It has the remains of roughly 24 mammals and an equivalent number of birds. It has one of the richest avifaunas, bird faunas, naturally occurring bird faunas of any site in North America, from what I understand. And most of the identification of these mammals and birds, the smaller ones especially, certainly the birds, were done by David Stedman, who was my colleague who came in from the New York State Museum to help out during those a few years after the discovery of the California condor back in 1984. So the bones are very well preserved. They're very diverse, and there's a very large avifauna and mammal fauna there as well, along with some reptiles and fishes and amphibians. Of course, lots and lots of frogs. There are frog bones everywhere. The bones, while they're well preserved and they're abundant, you almost never find them anatomically associated. They tend to be separate. Occasionally, in one case, we did find an extended part of a limb of a deer. Probably the most complete skeleton that we found was of an elk, which lay in that test pit that we dug in the deeper area in 1984. We found an almost complete skeleton of an elk. That's the diagram of that skeleton is included in the book. And what is peculiar about it is that all of the extremities are present, almost completely present, the limbs, the head, the neck, so on and so forth. But the central part of the body, the trunk and the ribs, are almost completely gone, which is very strange. And if I've interpreted this correctly, this carcass lay in a spring vent. It's probably about 1,000 years old. It lay in a spring vent, actually fortuitously right up against a mastodon tusk. Initially, we thought we had here an Ice Age elk because it was on the same level as the Ice Age and lay against a mastodon tusk. Now, based upon further evidence, it's almost certain that it's not Ice Age, but rather that it's Holocene, probably late Holocene. But that's the most complete thing that we found. The reason I think it was in a spring vent is, first of all, we can actually see a spring vent in the wall of the pit nearby, and the nature of the sediment in which the skeleton is encased, and also the fact that while the bones are to some degree dissociated, they're all kept together. And many of the limbs, most of the limbs are still articulated, but the bones are kind of jumbled. It's as if it lay in an environment in which there was moving water, but it was in a restricted area so that the bones were not washed away.
So it fell into a spring vent or something?
Well, we don't know. We don't know. My guess is that it was actually placed there. We know from the work of Daniel Fisher, who is an expert on mastodons and has done incredible work on interpreting the growth increments in their tusks to reconstruct their lives. He found evidence that mastodon remains of mastodons that had either been hunted and killed or scavenged by humans. Some of the remains were placed in storage in cold water in the late fall or early winter, so that presumably they would be refrigerated and would be accessible for eating as the winter was ending.
I did not expect that.
So it's possible. It's possible that that's what we're looking at here. But of course, a good number of thousands of years later, there's no reason that this might not have been done also by American Indians later on.
So it could be an American Indian fridge.
Possibly, but that's at this point it's complete speculation.
Yeah, but still, wow.
I'm not sure how else to interpret what we're seeing there.
I've probably got some meat that I've forgotten to take out of my fridge. But 2,000 years old.
I would say that one thing one would look for would be cut marks on the bone, none of which I've been able to recognize. Someone else might be able to recognize that. That's hopefully this will be taken on by people in the future. Okay,
but otherwise, how different is this layer? And I guess probably the one above it, the peaty, earthy, soily layer. How different are they to the modern? Because we're dealing with something that's like 1,000 years old.
How different are they? You mean in terms of the fauna and flora?
Yeah.
They're not different at all. It's the same. They're all animals that you recognize here today. There are a few that are no longer here due to extinction. For most notably, the passenger pigeon. Passenger pigeon bones in the woody layer. There are several times as many passenger pigeon bones in the woody layer as there are of all the other 24 or so species of birds combined. So the reports of how incredibly abundant that species was until about the mid 1800s seems to be supported.
Okay, so we'll come back to the humans in a second, but I just want to round up the fauna, the animals that were there. What was the rarest specimen? What was the biggest surprise? What was the most scientifically valuable one?
In the woody layer?
In any of the layers?
Yeah, it's. I think there was a. There was a. Well, I would have to check in an article by Dave Stedman. There was a prairie grouse or something like that that was not known from this area that was found. I mean, for me, one of the most significant things is recognizing the abundance of the passenger pigeon, that the reports of their incredible abundance does seem to be supported by what we see here. But the other birds that we find are birds that we're familiar with today. In fact, at our museum, a number of years ago, there was a wonderful exhibit of all, many birds from Western New York that were shown there. They were done. They were preserved by taxidermy and they were on display. And I made a point of going through and putting a little label indicating which of those were also found at the Hiscock Site. And there were quite a few of them. So it was the fauna and flora. You would not have been jolted to see any major difference between that of the past 1,000 or 2,000 years and that of today. I recently had the opportunity to go on a guided hike through a swampy area here in Western New York, a few miles south of Buffalo. And these were woods. It was the winter time, and there was ice on the ground. There was water, and we were, of course, walking in snowshoes. And I was intrigued to find that the fauna that you find in there and the types of trees were pretty much identical to the fauna and the flora that we were finding in the younger woody layer. So it was like I was standing in. I'd gone back in time, and I was standing in the swamp that was there during the earlier in the Holocene.
Oh, that's really lovely. Right. So then, let's talk about humans. Let's talk about people. So we've got our Indian fridge. Was there any other evidence of human occupancy at the site? Like, originally, people were looking for Paleo-Indian stuff as well, seeing as you had the Mastodon. Was there any evidence of them found?
Yeah, well, in the Pleistocene horizon, yes, we have found their tools. We found stone tools from Paleoindians, primarily what are called fluted points. These were the types of spear points that they had made, a very, very distinctive type of spear point. But what's interesting is that all of those that we found, none of those that we found had been used as a spear point, apparently, at the end of its useful life. Each of them had been modified into an alternative tool, a knife, gutting knives, scrapers, gravers, things like that. So that's telling us that something was going on at this site other than hunting or other than just hunting. And I understand from archaeologists familiar with this area, and with that time, that this is highly unusual at a Paleoindian site in the Northeast. We also find what we have interpreted and others have interpreted as bone tools, and that's one of the most interesting and important aspects of the site. Starting in 1990 or 1991, I began to come across bone fragments in the Pleistocene that looked very unusual. I mean, I was used to seeing broken fragments and worn fragments, but nothing that couldn't be explained just by natural breakage and wear. Now I was finding things that looked like, to my eyes anyway, like they really could not have happened naturally. So I took one of these specimens up to the Royal Ontario Museum to Dr. Peter Stork, who at that time was the archaeologist in charge of New World archaeology. And he introduced me to a gentleman named John Tomanchuk, who was working with him. John has a background in archaeology and also in engineering, in mechanical engineering. And he was able to take an object like these bones and look at them and analyze the breakage and the patterns and determine what the forces were, and thereby determine how likely it was that these were natural or cultural. And he spent the better part of a year at our museum. In fact, actually over a year, I think, at our museum, looking through the Pleistocene collection such as we had it at that time, which is still fairly early on. And he was able to recognize, I think we came up with something like 17, what he was satisfied, 17 specimens that he was satisfied were culturally modified. And he wrote a paper on this, describing all the forces involved and his interpretations of what these were. Now, I hasten to say, pardon me, that this is controversial because there are archaeologists, very competent people who are skeptical about bone tools because their interpretation is subjective. I'm not speaking just of what we feel are bone tools, but of many other bone tools. You have to approach these interpretations with great caution. But as far as I can see, and I think as far as most of the people that I've engaged with are concerned, that they're satisfied that these are or nearly all are bone tools, and in all likelihood there are many more there in the collection yet to be discovered. So that's one of the most unusual aspects of this site. And it reflects human activity at the site.
Okay, so what kinds of tools were they? I'm just imagining, like a cartoon bone in my head. I could maybe make a club out of it. I could make a stabbing thing. I could make a flute, maybe. I don't know.
Well, if you think about it, these people did not have access to hardware stores. They had to make their tools out of what they found there. And what we're mostly used to are the stone tools. They would need to find a quarry where there was a source of chert or flint which to make the tool. But also at this site, we now know they would have come there and found the remains of multiple animals that had died and whose remains were probably exposed. And there's no reason that one could not take a bone and, if it's the right type of bone, shatter it, let's say, with a large rock, and you would have some very sharp pieces of bone that you could use for cutting.
Okay, so they didn't have the hardware store, but they had the elephant watering and feeding hole,
Right.
the Mastodon watering and feeding hole that you could just go to and get bone.
Right. I'll give you an example of the first one that identified as a bone tool. This was a fragment of a rib that was split axially along its plane, so you can see the inner surface exposed. And what was peculiar about it is that it came to a a sort of a cylindrical end, and the tip of that cylindrical end was rounded as if it were the end of a broomstick that had been jammed against something. In other words, it looked to me like a tang, something that was designed to fit into a socket to hold the rest of that rib fragment. And this was the interpretation that John Tomanchuk had developed in studying the forces involved here. So interestingly, a little bit after that, I came across a neural spine, which means the part of the Mastodon shoulder vertebra, an elongate part of the shoulder vertebra, that had a very peculiar hole in it. And in examining that hole visually, and then with a CAT scan, I found that hole was not natural, that it had been modified, and that in some way, and that the end of the hole, the back wall of that hole did not coincide with the end of the marrow cavity. The marrow cavity extended beyond the visual back end of that hole, which was rounded. And in studying that, I came to the conclusion that this had been some sort of a socketed handle, perhaps for an object like that rib fragment to be socketed into. The tang would fit in there. It wasn't that fragment because the tang was not long enough to reach to the back of that hole. But that's another example. And then there are rib fragments that show stains on them, and pieces of ivory, fragments of tusk that have organic matter on them. Some that were modified into points. There's all types of objects there, and John Tomanchuk interpreted these for the most part as having, in one way or another, to do with the processing of hides. They were being used to work on soft, supple material, scraping hides in one way or another, cutting things, that type of thing. So he felt that he was seeing evidence of work mostly on hides, not only, but mostly on hides. Hide preparation at this site. One could imagine that these people were coming there and not so much hunting mastodons, but perhaps hunting caribou, because we find a lot of caribou is the second most abundant material there, but almost exclusively antler and just the bases of the antler. So something was going on there, something was interfering with the simple natural deposition of caribou skeletons. So it's possible that people were going there to hunt caribou, and that they were using these tools, including tools made from bones that they found at the site, to process the hides, to cut up the meat and to process the hides.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, the overabundance of antlers, could that just be because they shed them? Just trying to come up with a hypothesis. No.
You would think so, but these do not seem to be simple. They may have been shed, but what we're finding is only the basal parts of the antlers. And it's always, I think we have maybe a 10 or a dozen of these. They're all the same part of the antler. In all cases, the brow tine is gone. It's been broken off somehow, and the base of the antler has been burnished. It's dark color and it's polished in some way that does not look like what you find on a simple shed antler. There's one antler that we found that does have the remains of the burr, that rough ring at the base where it attached to the pedestal on the skull, and that also shows that it's been modified. It's been worn away, and only underneath the base of the brow tine, where there's a bit of a shadow, was it not completely worn away. So it may be that there's been some sort of cultural modification to those antlers, though that's one of the mysteries that remains to be worked out about the site.
Wow, that's amazing. Any theories? Write them down in the comments, everyone.
When I initially found them, I was thinking of these as maybe being used to rub against hides to perhaps help to break up the fibers and soften the hides. But it's possible. But there are alternative possibilities, but they're just so bizarre. And the fact that that's almost all we find of caribou. We found maybe 3 fragments of limb bones, but again, something like a dozen of these antlers, and we don't find the upper parts of the antlers at the site, just these bases. So something is going on there. I don't pretend to have the equipment to intellectual or physical to know the answer yet, but again, it's something that I would like to work on, or hopefully someone in the future will work on.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so I love how this site has now evolved into something another like avenue of scientific significance, that of like human origins and human history. So are these a recognized people? Are they a named people? Who are they?
Well, there is a culture called the Clovis culture that was first recognized in the 1930s in Southwest United States, and it was recognized by these particular peculiar fluted points, which have subsequently been found all over the United States, ranging up on into Canada and down into a little ways into Mexico. But actually, some fluted points, possibly also, Clovis or Clovis type, have been found as far south as central Chile, which was what really surprised me. There are other these fluted points are found all over the place, as I said, and they seem to reflect a range of time, roughly from 11,100 to about 10,700 radiocarbon years ago. Although there are some slightly older some older outliers than those. Those that are found outside of the western United States, including those up here. Some archaeologists believe these are not, strictly speaking, Clovis, but these are maybe people who are, descended from the Clovis or reflect a related culture, but it's Clovis-like. So when I say Clovis, in the book I refer to them as quote Clovis or Clovis-like, because I was warned that there's not a complete agreement that these are purely identical to the Clovis material that was found in the Southwest. Okay.
So then, as we move up into the more modern, the woody layers, the ones that are 2,000 years old, that we've got our Indian fridge in, who are these people? Were they just Native Americans?
Yes, but they were. The Clovis were also Native Americans, but we don't fully understand exactly what the relationships were, between these people and modern people. Anatomical studies and genetic studies that have been done shows there's a deal of complexity.
Please forgive my dodgy terminology with it.
But in terms of culture, we in post-Pleistocene times, we have 7 projectile points, each representing a different culture. One of them is what's called a bifurcate base point, which dates to roughly a little over 8,000 years ago, so not too long after the end of the Ice Age. Um, we also have others that there's something that's called a Lamoka point that is a few thousand years younger than that. And the youngest projectile point we have is called a Madison point, which is the type of point that was used by Iroquois and related people, and that is probably in the neighborhood of 1,000 years old or a little bit younger. So we have a range going from 8,000 plus to 1,000 minus. In terms of just those projectile points. And then we also have a few other things, such as a couple of awls that were used for piercing, for penetrating, or a possible bone needle as well. And we have a bead. So the bottom line is that people were coming to the site for whatever reason, perhaps living around the site, pretty much, from the end of the Ice Age up to European incursion.
Okay, and then just to wrap it up with the discoveries, is there anything of that European incursion? I was just thinking, like 200, 300 years ago, which kinds of recognizable companies would they be? And I was thinking, you might have Cadbury's chocolate, Guinness.
Unfortunately, we hope for that, but none of that has come out. Yes, we have found European cultural remains. Some of them are quite interesting, but I wouldn't say any of them are greatly surprising. One thing that we have, for example, is a piece of. We have a fair bit of glazed ceramic. And in one case, an intern, a high school intern who came and worked in my laboratory, was able to recognize what's called a maker's mark, which indicates who made it, and from that you can also date when it was made. It was made actually in England. England at that time was the workshop of the world in the early 1800s. It's a maker's mark of from a company that was working, I think from roughly 1818 to the early 1830s. And then another thing that we have is a clay pipe, whose style which was being made from roughly 1820 to roughly 1840. And then we have a piece of what looks like a Lafayette commemorative plate, which was very popular back in the early 1800s, celebrating the visit of General Lafayette, and I think it was 1824 at the invitation of our President Monroe. And commemorative plates were made, and apparently these were bought. And we have a small piece of what appears to be that commemorative plate, which would have been made sometime after 1824, presumably, or around 1824. So we have cultural remains that indicate the presence of people going back to the early 1800s, European people, the early 1800s at the site. And there's many more, European objects, and also the remains of some farm animals, notably horse, at the site.
Okay. And again, it's a wonderful parallel to what's happening with the animals, that you've got what's happening with the humans, like the tools that have been left in the Ice Age, the tools that have been left a few thousand years ago, and the commemorative plates that were left 200 years ago. Mm-hmm. Right. So just to summarize then, like we've gone through so much history, like 12,000 years of history of this one place, and we've also gone through the history, a little bit of your research there over the last couple of decades. So are you satisfied with piecing together all of this history, and during this time of your research over what would be 30 years plus for all the work that was done after it, have your interpretations of it like changed significantly? Are they probably still going to change into the future?
Well, I'm sure that there will be changes. My experience has been that I can look at something and it seems so patently obvious that I'm totally satisfied with my interpretation. And then along comes some additional information later on, and it makes me go back and revisit my interpretation and find that I was wrong. And that's to me, that's something that has happened throughout my career. I think it's a common thing to happen in any scientist's career. And I would be very much surprised if in the future new interpretations were made of the material that has come out of the site that would be at odds with my interpretation, or that would add new layers of understanding to it. That's the nature of the scientific method.
Okay, and as you have now retired and presumably not working on this all the time, are there any mysteries that still remain that keep you awake at night trying to ponder what was going on?
Well, yeah, there are still mysteries there. Two of the more obvious ones are, well, you've already brought up one, which is those caribou antlers. To me, those need investigation. Something. There's a story there. Something interesting was going on, I believe. The other is a very peculiar beveled tusk that was found. And this is illustrated in the book. Nothing like that has ever been found before, so far as my inquiries have indicated. It's a Mastodon tusk that has been beveled flat along its entire length, smoothly beveled flat, including the pulp cavity. So in all likelihood, this could not be explained by something that was done during the life of the animal. It appears to be post-mortem. And I have no idea what this is. Some interpretations have been suggested, but it's so strange, so bizarre that, again, this is something that I'm sure someone in the future will look at with clearer eyes than I have, and probably with more, maybe more better technology, and hopefully come up with an explanation for what it is. And then I'm sure there are all types of hidden problems and hidden stories in that collection, which is the most important tangible result of our work, the collection and the data, where questions will be asked of it by future researchers that don't even occur to us today.
Is the more data still underground? Do you ever want to go back? Do you ever think, oh, it's only like a couple of hours drive away, I could just go and...
Well, it's there is hope. My hope is that in the future, a public institution will go back there and continue the work, do more of the work. And I know that there's yet more information to be found from that site. I think just about most of the low-hanging fruit, as they say, has been collected, plus and then some. But I know that there's still material out there that can inform us much more about the history of that site.
Okay, and then just to finish on the legacy of the site. So this site seems to have had a huge impact on science. It's had a huge impact on you, presumably 30 years
Sure.
of your life spent digging there. It must have had a huge impact on the volunteers and the local community, the country. How far of a range of impact did this dig have?
Well, I'm told that people are aware of this site in other parts of the world, and there's a literature that has been developed about this site, which is included is a bibliography in the book, specifically of the scientific publications. The book, by the way, was intended as a scientific work. I wasn't looking to write a popular work, but it became clear to me as I was putting it together that the story behind this dig was so compelling that it would be of interest to people who had lay people who were interested in archaeology and paleontology. But I tried to include in it everything that a researcher would need to get a good understanding of the site, and the work on it, flaws and all, and to either be included right there in the book, or it would tell them where to go to get additional information that they would need. That, I think, is the legacy. The site, the collection is there for researchers to come and to work with. It's a library of specimens that I hope will be consulted for generations to come, because I know there's much, much, much more information in there to be had. And it's important in the scientific method for other researchers to come and to examine the materials and the conclusions of the principal investigator, to see if they agree or disagree, and to see what they can add or what they can change. That, I think, is the legacy, the collection, the data, because you can't separate the collection, the specimens, from the data. And I hope this book, which puts everything together and adds more information that has not yet been published, will help to tie the whole thing together into a nice, neat ball for people to work with.
Mm-hmm. And for our audience that like the proximity to the science, that like the details, that like not just like reading the headlines and just accepting it, that you want more than the paper as well. It's a wonderful crossover. I think, like, I've read the whole thing to do this interview, and it's a wonderful like trip between the details of the dig and then of the people that are there doing it, of the realities of the camp, of how everything worked, of the chronological development of the camp parallel to the chronological understanding of what's going on. And the book like meanders between them, and it is thoroughly recommended. So make sure you do pick up a copy of it.
Yeah, to me, the whole thing has been a privilege. I happened to be at the right place at the right time, and the people I had the privilege to work with, both professional and amateurs, were just incredible. It's an incredible privilege to have been able to get to know them and to work with them.
Okay, Dick, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thank you, Dave. I've really enjoyed this, and thank you so much for making it flow so easily.
Paleocast was brought to you by Dave Marshall and Liz Martin Silverstone, with contributions from Tom Fletcher, Vish Venkat, and Elsa Pancharoli. Music was composed by Patrick Kendall Smith. Paleocast was made possible by funding from the Paleontological Society and the Paleontological Association, but the show now relies on funding from you, the listeners. So, if you've liked this episode, please consider donating, and thanks to everyone that's helped out so far. Please visit paleocast.com for the supplementary material to this episode and for our archive of past programs, and follow us across social media platforms to get all the latest news. Finally, if you enjoy our podcast, then please explore all of our video content on YouTube and follow our other projects, the Virtual Natural History Museum and the Paleocast Gaming Network.